For more than a year now, our cultural and political leaders have been telling us that Russia is the greatest threat we face. They say that relentlessly every day and in every forum. Whole channels are devoted to this message. Russia hacked our election. We must fight back with sanctions. We must expel their diplomats. We must fight them. We've done all of those things. In recent months, for example, we've killed hundreds of Russian citizens in Syria. Feel safer yet? Probably not. By now, you likely understand that the Russia story is fundamentally dishonest. It is propaganda, just like most things our elites tell us. Russia is not the biggest threat to this country, not even close. China is. Our elites never say that because they're getting rich from China, and they're on China's side. 17 years ago, we welcomed China into the World Trade Organization. China's entry was supposed to strengthen the American economy and encourage China to become more free. Neither happened. Instead, millions of American jobs disappeared disproportionately from our middle class. China routinely ignores WTO rules to wage economic war against us. Our trade deficit has exploded, and of course, China has not become a free country. It's become more authoritarian. And why wouldn't it become more authoritarian? Our elites do not push back because they don't care about democracy. They're fine with dictatorship as long as they're profiting from it. Democracy, after all, is what brought them Brexit and Donald Trump, and they're not for that. Just this very morning, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright accused the Trump administration of abetting, quote, the resurrection of fascism. Huh, really? How exactly are they doing that? Is the White House, I don't know, sucking up to the fascist leaders of America's main military and economic rival? Nope. Madeleine Albright's doing that, though. She can barely stop praising the Chinese dictatorship. In 2013, Albright said this about the unelected leader of China, Xi Jinping, quote, he has shown a deep interest not only in building stronger ties with the United States, but with our country itself. Barf. If you think that's embarrassing, though, how about this one? Quote, he appeared to be very much attuned to the needs of his domestic constituents. Those constituents, by the way, can go to jail for criticizing him. 3 years later, Albright described China's entry into the WTO as a success, presumably for China. She said the U.S. and China could cooperate on cyber issues, totally ignoring the fact that China is by far the biggest hacker of U.S. secrets, military and industrial secrets. Yes, even bigger than Russia. After all that slobbering, you will not be surprised to learn that Madeleine Albright's company has a huge presence in China. She knows exactly who's paying the bills. Most of our elites do. That's why they denounce America as fascist while describing China as remarkable or emerging, a success story. And for them it is. But for the rest of us, China is a looming threat. China has dramatically increased its defense spending recently, and that's not just for self-defense. While Madeleine Albright was getting rich from flattering dictators, the Chinese military has spread its reach around the world. The military of China just opened its first overseas military base, which is along key shipping lanes in the Horn of Africa in Djibouti. China has now more than 350,000 students studying in this country, and according to our FBI director, Christopher Wray, many of them are spies for the Chinese government. They're assisted in that by about 100 China-funded Confucius Institutes, which operate freely on U.S. university campuses, but in fact function as sources of Chinese propaganda. At home, China's government imposes tyranny on its people. For example, they just banned online sales of the Bible this week. Their censorship online is legendary. But the censorship extends also to this country, amazingly enough, and nobody ever mentions it. American movies, for example, they're altered to avoid offending the Chinese government, which can, in effect, block their release. An American employee at Marriott was fired recently after he liked a tweet that referred to Tibet as a separate country. China didn't like that, so Marriott canned him. Mercedes-Benz, the car maker, they just apologized to the Chinese government for featuring the Dalai Lama in an ad. Chinese government doesn't like the Dalai Lama, and that's why universities around the world are increasingly wary of inviting him to speak. They don't want to offend the Chinese. China, to remind you, is a fascist country, so you'd think it would be a global pariah, right? Our elites would hate it. Our blue states would block travel to China the way they block travel to North Carolina over its bathroom policies. Of course they don't do that. California Governor Jerry Brown just went to China last year and nobody cared. Google, biggest company, most powerful company in the world, massively expanding its artificial intelligence operations in China, even though that will almost certainly empower the Chinese military. But don't pay attention. Ignore all of that. Avert your gaze because remember, Russia is the real threat. And if you disagree with that, you obviously work for Putin. Harry Kazianis is Director of Defense Studies at the Center for the National Interest, and he joins us tonight. Harry, put this, you never hear anybody say this, but let's be as honest as we can be, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I mean, Russia is not a threat at all compared to the threat posed by China. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, just look at the numbers for a second. Russian economy worth $1.4 trillion. Not small, but not a superpower. Chinese economy, $11 trillion. If you actually look at purchasing power parity, China is actually a bigger economic superpower than the United States. So if you just look at the raw numbers, the Chinese are much more, in terms of just the scale, a much bigger challenge for the United States. So, you know, look, Russia's a problem. Russia's a strategic competitor. But China, if you put everything together, China's an enemy.
Which country is expanding more aggressively its military presence around the world, China or Russia?
Oh, China, by far. I mean, even if you just look in East Asia for a moment, not even looking globally, the Chinese want to dominate the South China Sea, where you've got $5 trillion of shipping goods that are actually moving through that. That would allow the Chinese to dominate all of East Asia. They want to subjugate Taiwan, a democracy with 25 million people. They want to dominate the East China Sea. And they're building out all of their military in Asia to do this. And they're actually developing certain missiles to target our aircraft carriers. So the threat is very real when it comes to China.
So which country, Russia or China, has hacked more information networks in the United States?
I think this is a trick question. It's China. The Chinese, for example, have hacked pretty much every military industrial thing that we use to project military power. The F-35 worth over $1 trillion, the F-22, the Gerald Ford aircraft carrier, the V-22 Osprey, all of that is worth probably trillions of dollars. But also when you factor in things like AI, other things that they're trying to hack into, they essentially could become a superpower by just stealing all of this stuff off.
And they're doing that. So my final question, given everything you just said, which is all true, if you really cared about the United States, you'd be way more concerned about China than Russia. Our elites are not. So here's the final question. Do more people in Washington get rich representing or working for Russia or China?
China, obviously. But Tucker,
I don't know if it's obvious to our viewers. I don't think, because the impression over the last year and a half has been everyone in D.C. is working for Russia. Some are. But as compared to the number like Madeleine Albright, who are doing business with China, much smaller number, correct?
Yeah, and look, obviously the threat is China. And you know what, Tucker, this has been something that's building since 1991. Remember, the reason that the United States and China became friendly was because of the fall of the Soviet Union.
Right.
When the Soviet Union went to the scrap heap of history, there was going to be a strategic rivalry. Now that's been was put aside because of trade relations. We have a $650 billion trade relationship with China, but the American people are rightly questioning that, and obviously that's creating strategic rivalry, and that makes sense.
But don't you think somebody in authority, maybe a former Secretary of State like Madeleine Albright, a self-described genius, ought to be sounding the alarm about this, rather than distracting our attention with dumb fake story after dumb fake story about a non-existent threat from Russia?
Well, you know what? I think the problem is there's really, when you boil down to it, there's a strategic awakening that's happening here. I think when you boil everything together, when you take China hacking into the OPM, stealing all our military industrial prowess, people are waking up to this, and it's the American people that are asking these questions. And I think Donald Trump is one of the people who's finally awakened all of us to this challenge. And when you put all of these things together, China pushing in the South China Sea, Taiwan, East China Sea, I think people are starting to get that the real threat is not Russia, it is in fact China. It's the threat of our time.
There are a lot of things to criticize about Trump, but on this and a couple other core issues, he's absolutely right, and they hate him for that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the truth. I'm sorry to say that. I'm not flacking for Trump. I'm just acknowledging reality because I care about America.
Absolutely.
Harry, thank you for that.
Thank you.
We've got a Fox News alert for you. As that segment was in progress, Defense Secretary James Mattis has signed orders tonight deploying up to 4,000 National Guard troops to the Mexican border. The Texas National Guard already has begun deploying 150 troops. Arizona has ordered up 250. There will be more, and we'll continue to follow the story, obviously, as it develops. The Trump administration says it plans to roll back an Obama-era policy that made schools more dangerous and has led to some of the tragedies we've recently covered. We'll give you details next.